Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for part 2 of the July 2022 Q&A series.
It is 2022, yeah.
Yep, we answered a whole bunch of questions in part 1, which is up on the channel right now if you want to see the first part of that. But there's more questions from our wonderful YouTube supporters and Discord members, so we'll get to those in just a moment. But before we do...
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by ASUS's latest range of ROG anime peripherals. The new ROG Strix Flare 2 anime gaming mechanical keyboard features an anime matrix LED display, 8000Hz polling rate, ROG NX mechanical switches or Cherry MX switches, swappable switches, metal media controls, and a wrist rest with light diffuser. And there's also the new ROG Delta S anime lightweight gaming headset with a customizable anime matrix display, Hi-Fi ESS 9281 quad DAC, AI noise cancelling mic, and is compatible with PC, PlayStation 5, and Nintendo Switch. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
Time for the crystal ball, Tim, with next-gen GPUs scheduled to come in the following months towards the end of the year. There will continue to be drops in the price of top end of this generation. How much do you think current gen cards at the top end would have to be to warrant buying now rather than waiting? For example, 3090 for maybe $600, given the 4070/7700 XT should be the replacement. So, yeah, I think our advice for this has been pretty consistent over the last couple of months. We've seen a few differing opinions lately, but certainly for our opinion is that you shouldn't be buying high-end cards at the moment. The value just isn't there at current pricing. They're still far too expensive in my opinion, especially for products like 3090 Ti and 3090, which are still, well over $1,000 US. Doesn't make a lot of sense to buy those cards at that price, I don't think. I've always sort of been saying that tier lower pricing is potentially where it starts to make sense, ideally lower than tier lower. So that would mean a 3080 at the price of a 3070, so around $500 US, potentially a 3090 around the price of a 3080, which would be around $800 US MSRP we're talking about here, of course. Around that level, but probably lower than that level, is I think where the target sort of is, because typically the next generation of cards will produce tier lower performance. So what used to be 3080 is now hopefully going to be 4070 type performance, or even 4060, depending on how much performance they can gain. So you would definitely be wanting minimum tier lower pricing.
2080 Ti, 3070.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, I think the easiest way to put it is we've seen month-on-month price declines at the high end. That's where the substantial discounts have been at the high end, month on month. You've shown this.
Yep.
We're just months away now from the next generation cards. That is probably the point where I would be making my purchase. We know the announcement. We know pretty well for a fact that there are so many 30 series cards that they're probably not going to be able to sell them all in time. They'll still be on sale at discounted prices well after the next generation arrives, which again we expect to be in a few months based on what we're hearing from multiple different sources. So, in my opinion, it seems a bit crazy to jump the gun and spend like $1,500 US on a 3090 Ti right now, because we expect that to drop in price for the next update, and then it could drop quite considerably depending on what the next generation delivers. As soon as NVIDIA makes the announcement and they give some concrete numbers that look really promising, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
They're just going to fall off a cliff like we saw the 2080s. That was a $1,200 card, which regularly sold. Was it $1,200? It sounds crazy saying that was $1,200, and it regularly sold for more than $1,200. And the second the 3080 was announced, what were they selling for? Like $400, $500?
$500, used,
crazy,
I believe.
Yeah, they just fell off a cliff.
I think the fear around the recommendations to sort of buy now or when to buy comes from the supply side of things, like the fear that you're not going to be able to buy a next gen card, which is then going to make current gen cards more expensive. But I think that is a pretty big misread of why cards were expensive previously. A lot of that was due to cryptocurrency mining, which isn't, at least it's looking very likely to be significantly less of a concern with the upcoming generation. So unless there's a massive U-turn in not even just cryptocurrency pricing, but the actual profitability, which is the thing that matters. If that U-turns, then maybe it'll be an issue. But I certainly think it will be in a situation with this GPU launch that's more like GPU launches prior to this current generation, more like 20 series, 10 series, those sort of launches,
which means
cards aren't going to be available for a few months, but
that's right.
Not for years.
That's the important thing to be aware of, guys. When these new cards come out, they are, without a shadow of a doubt, going to sell out instantly. And it'll be, I would say, historically it's been a minimum of 2 weeks before you can sort of start to get them. I would be thinking more like 4 weeks at this point. So when the new Radeon or GeForce GPUs come out, if you're not scrambling, fighting tooth and nail to get your hands on one, you're going to have to wait a month or two, which not the end of the world, and probably a smarter thing to do anyway, because, hey, sometimes there's driver issues that need to be sorted out before you're not having your games crash over and over and over again. So my advice would be sit back, relax, watch the reviews, see how it plays out, and get a card then, because we don't expect cryptocurrency to cause any headaches early on, at least.
Yeah, I think for buying this current generation, there's kind of 2 windows that I'd be looking at as sort of the target for when to buy and when we expect pricing to be at that tier lower or even lower level. And that's in between when the next-gen cards are announced and when they launch, because that's when, as you say, the panic will ensue from existing owners where they'll want to sell as high as possible before the next-gen cards come out and ruin their party a little bit. Then I expect that there'll be a period when the cards aren't available, as you've been talking about the next-gen cards, where pricing on the older models will probably be pretty stagnant because new models aren't available, the old models are kind of serving the market during that period. And then once the new generation cards start coming into stock again, that's when you get the final sell of the old models. And that's when they'll really start hitting basement prices. So you're kind of looking at in between the announcement and the release. And then once we get wide availability, that's when I believe you'll get the best deal on those GPUs. And that's historically been the case pretty much every time except for this past generation. So fingers crossed that's what happens again at the end of this year.
With NVIDIA facing such an excess of supply, I do think we could see another 2060 KO. I think only EVGA did that, didn't they? But that was
not sure.
I think so. We never got. I don't think we ever got one in Australia.
No, I don't think we ever looked at it.
IE cut down 90 Ti dies, but with other higher tier features left in.
It's a bit of a bizarre card, I think, that one, because I believe they were using 2080 dies at the time and using that for 2060s. And then I think Gamers Nexus discovered that they had some sort of productivity advantage over the regular 2060 model, which was very strange. I think in the current market, they're probably not going to do something like that. I think they'll probably just try and sell out their existing inventory for those higher tier models, especially because pricing is still quite inflated for those lower tier cards. So demand for them seems to be pretty strong. So I'm not sure what advantage you get from trying to cut down it that far.
Yeah, anything's possible, but I wouldn't be expecting to see that again.
No, it seems like more of an experimentation thing for a short period. But and particularly because a lot of the excess supply that we've got right now is excess supply of cards that are already made. So to do something like this, they kind of have to make more GPUs, like making another collection of 3060s.
I have to admit, I'm not that knowledgeable in the 2060 KO. I don't think it was particularly popular, as in there wasn't that many of them. And from memory, wasn't it designed largely because I think it was NVIDIA's partner, so I think it was EVGA, a direct partner. I think it was to spoil the 5600 XT launch.
Potentially.
I think it was the 5600
XT. It lowered the price of the 2060 by $50 US or something.
Yeah, to compete with the 5600 XT directly. And the 5600 XT spoiled the 5600 XT's launch because AMD completely botched the clock specifications, and that was a complete disaster. Right, I'm pretty sure it was a ploy to spoil that launch, which AMD managed to spoil all on their own, so NVIDIA didn't need to do that, or EVGA or whatever it was. So probably won't see it again. But anyway. Alrighty, when the current generation of GPUs were released, NVIDIA was criticized for including low amounts of VRAM on their higher-end cards, 3070 and 3080. Now, almost 2 years later, was the VRAM enough? Or are those cards hurt by the limited amount of VRAM? Alright, so if I recall correctly, I don't think I criticized NVIDIA for the RTX 3080. I think I mentioned that it was a bit disappointing that as a card that was predominantly targeting 4K. It only had 10 gigs, but I didn't.
It wasn't a deal breaker.
It certainly wasn't a deal breaker. It wasn't a problem immediately. It was a concern for maybe future ray tracing titles, high texture packs, all that sort of stuff. But I thought you'd probably get away with that. I think in follow-up content, we certainly said that. The 3070, I'm pretty sure I did criticize NVIDIA for that one. Only 8 gigabytes. And I think it's been proven at this point that for a premium product, 8 gigabytes probably wasn't enough. And I know some people jump up and down about that because, look, for the most part, it was enough. That is true. And you can work around VRAM limits pretty well. But if you bought a 3070 to enjoy high quality texture packs, ray tracing enabled, like the most impressive visual experience possible. I've seen loads of examples, and I've run into some of them myself, where you do run out of VRAM with a 3070. There are games that does that, Far Cry 6 is an example. And there's plenty more. You don't have to search too far on YouTube to see users testing out the latest and greatest games on a 3070 using ray tracing, and at some point in the game running into VRAM limitations.
Yeah, and sure, you can reduce the texture quality and that sort of thing, but I think on a higher end card like a 3070, especially with the prices that they actually were selling for that last couple of years, it feels a bit slim on that front. I think it was exacerbated by its direct competitor having more VRAM, the 6700 XT and 6800 XT. The 6800 XT had 16 gig.
The 67 had 12.
6712, which is still more. And also that the 3070 was very similar performance to the 2080 Ti, but the 2080 Ti was an 11 gigabyte card.
That's right.
So it kind of ran into that double whammy, whereas if those two things weren't a factor, then it would be easier to excuse. But that wasn't the case.
Yep.
So, I mean, some people are probably going to, answer this question and be like, yeah, well, I've got a 3070 and I can just turn down the high texture pack and I don't even notice the difference in textures. But I think in that class of car that you're buying, you should kind of expect to use maximum quality settings. Because if it was a 3060 or something like that, it's like, okay, sure, you don't have to run it at that. But you're talking a $500, but actually like well over $1,000 GPU.
Humorously, the 3060 has more VRAM.
Yeah, so that was also a problem. And
they kind of self-admitted they screwed up there, but whatever.
I think with a lot of these, something we've talked about many times in these Q&As is that we're not quite at the so-called next gen of gaming when it comes to console generations. We're sort of in that transitory period as game developers start utilizing next generation game engines that are designed specifically for next gen GPUs and consoles, use direct storage, ray tracing as sort of like key features. Once those start to become more, we get more and more games that are like that, I expect VRAM requirements for games to increase quite substantially.
And to be clear, I never said that the 8 gigabytes of VRAM on the 3070 was a deal breaker.
Yeah.
Merely that it was disappointing and concerning for 2, 3, 4 years down the track. How that it was basically just highlighting that potential issue, but not saying that necessarily needs to be factored into the buying decision now. Things that you can benefit from now are ray tracing, performance, which is better, DLSS, all that. But anyway, all of that stuff is in the reviews.
It's definitely a future-looking thing. Like, I think 2 years later, you probably wouldn't have expected too many games to start utilizing massive amounts of VRAM, but certainly in the next couple of years, I would be expecting more impressive fidelity games coming out that do require more than that. But we'll see. We'll see whether that was... I'm sure you'll do a revisit in a couple of years and we'll see for sure which card ended up being the better choice.
Let's say I'm a vendor neutral and looking to buy a high-end next-gen GPU. In your opinion, how long does it make sense to wait for the other vendor to announce/launch their competing product? I would say, because normally when we review a product from one of the vendors and we know that in 2 or 3 months the other one will come, we pretty much always caution you about jumping in right now, because that product, the current product, could be discounted to compete better with the upcoming product, or the upcoming product may come at the same price but just be better product, and you can make a more informed buying decision. I guess that's the point. And I would say 2 to 3 months. I wouldn't go too much above 3 months. And you've sort of got to keep in mind that once the product's launched, if you want to get it at a reasonable price or have a good chance of getting it without having to click refresh 1,000 times a second, generally there's about a month delay in there anyway. So when the first product launches, Realistically, if you're wanting to get it at a reasonable price, you're probably going to have to wait another month anyway, which brings the product coming in 2 to 3 months, 1 or 2 months out. And then if that product comes and it's like, oh no, that's clearly the product I want, then you possibly have to wait another month and get that. But I think 2 to 3 months.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think, especially with this upcoming generation, it's quite likely that we'll be seeing reviews of one card around the time that the other vendors have at least announced the product or are very close to announcing it.
They'll be much closer than that, yes.
So I think, especially with this generation, I would strongly recommend waiting for both generations to be launched or at very least announced.
Yep.
Because that will give you at least some idea of what pricing is looking like, where the sort of targets are for those sorts of things. So yeah, I think in other years you could maybe the 2 to 3 months makes sense. Whereas I think for this generation, definitely we're looking at probably closer than that time frame, and you should have a lot of information by the time it comes around to your buying decision, which will be great because having all that information will allow you to make better decisions. So that's what we like to see.
Yep.
All right, Pete asks, are you interested in Linux-based operating systems at all? With the Steam Deck, Wine, and Proton software, the future of gaming on Linux looks better than ever with lots of compatibility and support. Would a 5 or 10 game Linux versus Windows benchmark using the same hardware interest you as reviewers and tech enthusiasts? I assume not everything in your benchmark suite would be available. I think Linux is looking better than it has in the past for gaming, but I still don't really see too much of a reason to use it over Windows when Windows is just right there and has better compatibility. Doesn't make... Yeah, I get the whole point of like, you can now actually play some games on Linux and you can emulate them and all those sorts of things. But for me personally, I don't see why I would do that when I could just play the games natively on Windows and not have to bother with the potential issues of emulation or...
Yeah, I'm guessing if they're saying for the games that are natively supported, if they perform better. But I guess the short answer is we're certainly more interested than we have been in the past.
I think, I guess if there are games that do run better on Linux, then maybe, but I'm not sure. You'd have to have quite a few games running better to offset the... Some games have to be emulated, compatibility issues. You know, the drivers on Linux tend to be less well
to be more
developed for GPUs.
It'd be more of a this is looking more promising than ever type thing.
I think it definitely makes sense for things like, obviously, the Steam Deck, because that runs Linux natively. It's very unlikely that you'd bother running Windows on it because it's optimized for Linux. So testing those systems and looking at how Linux games makes a lot of sense to me. But yeah, I don't think we're at the point, at least from what I've seen in terms of game support, that Linux is there as we're now sort of considering it an equal to Windows for gaming support. It still seems to be that, it's getting there, but, you'd probably still pick Windows most of the time, which is probably why we continue to benchmark primarily on Windows.
Yeah, that's fair.
What kind of overhead should be expected for running 3+ monitors? And at what point does Hardware Unboxed recommend going for an ultra-wide? I think once you get over a certain number of monitors, your GPU's clock speed does increase at idle.
Yeah, so it uses more idle power.
But apart from that, there's no other significant effects.
Like benchmarkable differences, like you use more CPU or whatever, more GPU. No. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I've done a triple display testing and stuff like that and compared it with just the game running on one display without those displays there, and it made no difference. Whether that's the case for all hardware configurations, can't say for sure, but I'd expect that to be the norm, that there's no real overhead there.
Yeah, I mean, multiple monitors gives you more opportunities to run more applications at once, so it's easier to have a YouTube video running at the same time, or your Discord chat, which are two things that you just recently benchmarked in your video, so you don't have to alt-tab between those two things. But generally speaking, they're still going to be treated as background apps, even if they're visible, because your foreground app is going to be your game. So yeah, it shouldn't be too different. I mean, ultra-wides, they're recommendable for a variety of reasons, but I don't think that this really plays into it at all.
No. Okay. Does the CPU affect ray tracing performance at the same resolution? Okay. Based on Spider-Man's Remastered's requirements, where if you want to run ray tracing, they recommend the same GPU, so at the 3070, but recommend a change in CPU from the 3060 to the 3070, 3700X. So I think they're saying without ray tracing, the Ryzen 5 3600 is okay, but if you want to use ray tracing,
I think so.
You need the Ryzen 730. Okay.
But the GPU requirements stay the same, apparently, for both presets.
Right, okay.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting one as well, because generally speaking, those two CPUs in like the same game, the 3700X is just, it's either faster or it's not. Like, unless you enable a specific setting that utilizes more cores. So are they saying ray tracing will utilize more cores if available?
Yeah, because the general cache performance and frequency is very similar between those two parts.
I guess what they're saying, perhaps the game does utilize 8 cores, but on a 3700X, it might only utilize them to, say, 50 or 60%. But if you enable ray tracing, the percentage goes up. So it's sort of I don't want to make it a core thing. I don't want to confuse the subject as a core thing. It's more of an overall CPU performance thing.
Well, first of all, ray tracing does increase the CPU load, because parts of the ray tracing things that need to go on, the algorithm, if you want to call it that, there are some CPU components to that. So yes, if you had the GPU power to run the ray tracing effect with no impact, then your CPU requirements would go up. The thing I find interesting about that requirements section is that enabling ray tracing is much more likely to bottleneck you on the GPU before the CPU.
Yeah.
So by keeping the GPU requirements the same, the 3070, are they saying that enabling ray tracing has no hit to GPU performance? Because that would be extremely surprising. It's very likely to cause a significant impact to GPU performance. Now, they may be saying, well, you're going to be running the game either natively with no ray tracing or potentially ray tracing plus upscaling, which could balance that a bit and then maybe cause that increased CPU load that they're talking about. But that would be a weird way to set out the system requirements, because you'd think that you'd also use upscaling for non-ray tracing if that feature was available, because we've shown many times that DLSS and other technologies can benefit you even with ray tracing disabled. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird one, that one. I would have said they should have gone the other way and said that you should be upgrading your 3070 to like a 3080 for ray tracing and keeping the CPU the same, because you're much more likely to be GPU bottlenecked.
Well, look, as you said, it can enabling ray tracing can increase the CPU's load.
Yep.
I think the takeaway here is that can happen, but also with ray tracing enabled, you don't require 8 cores, because I think some people will see that they recommend 6 cores without ray tracing, then 8 cores with ray tracing. That is not what this suggests at all. It suggests that you need that level of CPU performance. So a Ryzen 5 5600X is definitely a better gaming CPU than the 3700X. So my assumption here would be that the 5600X would still be faster than the 3700X, despite the fact that it's 6 cores versus 8 cores with ray tracing enabled. Anyway, that'll be probably something interesting to benchmark and check out when we can. All right, what's your opinion on the 8GB 6500 XT Sapphire just announced? I don't have too many opinions on it. I did reach out to Sapphire because the Discord members made me. They wanted to see a review, and I said, please don't make me review another 6500 XT, but they said, no, it must happen. So I reached out to Sapphire, and they said they're not sampling media, so no plans to sample anyone that particular product.
Probably for the best, given the 6500 XT's reception. But I mean, it's not a card that really needs 8GB of memory.
Look, it'd be a lot better with 8 gigs of memory.
If it was the same price.
If it was the same price, I don't believe I would recommend it, but it would be a lot better product. There's no doubt about it. It would be a lot better product.
I guess where I'm coming from is that it's a fairly slow, crappy card.
Yeah.
So creating an 8GB model is not exactly the list of priorities for new GPU releases.
No. But as you say, if it had have originally released with 8
that would have been better.
It would have been a much better product. I'm not saying it would have been necessarily a good product, but it would have been much better. PCIe 3.0 bandwidth concerns wouldn't have been nearly as much of a concern, because to exceed 8GB VRAM capacity on an entry-level card, you've really got to be trying. And in fact, it would be very difficult, because for the most part, you're limited to medium to low quality settings. But yeah, in some instances, or quite a few instances, that will exceed 4GB in modern games, but not 8. So anyway, that's really all there is to say on that one. Not too many thoughts, and I doubt we'll be reviewing it because I'm not sure it'll be worth buying that product when it eventually does make its way to market. But Sapphire aren't sampling it, so I'm not sure they're too confident the reviews would be particularly favorable based on that.
Yep.
Do you see people on older boards, so older motherboards, with PCIe 3.0 having notably lower performance with this upcoming generation of GPUs? And this could be bandwidth related or also from a lack of support for things like resizable bar. The next generation of GPUs, I don't know. I thought that might be a problem with this generation, and it wasn't really for the most part. It was more how many lanes you had, which became the problem for cards that had like 4 lanes or 8 lanes or whatever.
I think that's the primary concern.
That's the primary concern I would have thought.
The primary concern would be AMD coming out again with like let's say they've got a 7600 XT, like the 600 series, which I believe was PCIe times 8 this generation, wasn't it? PCIe 4.0 times 8. But if that card is now substantially faster, then yeah, that could potentially have a few issues.
So PCIe 2.0, there's already a performance penalty to pay there. 3.0 though, as long as you've got times 16 bandwidth, I think that will be perfectly fine. I don't think there'll be much of a difference going to PCIe 4.0 or 5.0. Well, I think 4.0, let's say. So, yeah. Okay, Tim, we're going to end this one with a very serious question. What happens when you combine the power of Tim with the power of Steve? Well, I would say you end up with a lot of pissed off companies trying to pass off sub-quality products. I don't know. What have you got?
No, nothing better than that. All right, and that does it for our Q&A series for July. Yeah, it's been pretty good month for questions. Let's be honest, not a whole lot has been happening in the sort of release scene. We are expecting a whole bunch of releases towards the end of the year, but still managed some very interesting questions, which is always good. So
I think there might have to be 3 parts next month.
I think we're starting to get into like 3-part territory in the next couple of months, as a lot of releases will be coming up soon. So yeah, stay tuned for those, I guess. If you missed part 1, go back and check out that part as well. We also have our Patreon and Float Plan accounts if you want to support the channel directly and get some cool perks in the meantime, like our monthly live streams that we just did. There'll be another one next month for you to, I guess, watch live if you want to. All the replays of all the previous ones that we've done in history are available. So a bit of a podcast series, I guess, there for you. And BTS videos, Discord chats, a lot of fun with you guys. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. Anything else to add?
Nope, I'm happy with that. You did a good job. Well done.
Good. Yep, nice.
So, yeah, who are you?
I'm Tim.
I'm Steve.
See you next time.